Welcome to the 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Sam Sussman about his autobiographical novel, Boy from the North Country, where the quest to determine whether Bob Dylan is in fact his father gives way to the deeper story of his love for his mother in her final days.
Part of what I hoped to do in writing this book, I felt that her death was the most difficult piece of the universe I had been given. And what it meant for me was to write a novel in which the love would be larger than the grief and the loss, in which I could tell a story to other people who'd been through something similar, and in which that might mean something to them. That's what my mother thought art was for.
Sam Sussman is originally from the Hudson Valley, and he has lived in Jerusalem, Berlin, and England. He graduated with a BA from Swarthmore and an MPhil from Oxford, and has taught writing and literature seminars around the world. His writing has been recognized by BAFTA and published in Harper's Magazine. Boy from the North Country is his first novel. It debuted as a USA Today bestseller and was picked by our partners at the Jewish Book Council as the next New Read selection, their new bi-monthly subscription series spotlighting remarkable Jewish literature. In this episode, Sam shares how reading Chaim Potak's My Name is Asher Lev gave him a vision of literature not as a private endeavor, but as communal.
The idea that there was a community where people sat around, what does he say, the dinner affairs and cocktail parties and talk about a work of art. I wanted to belong to that world. And I thought if I kept reading, that maybe I would enter it.
And we'll hear why Sam gave his protagonist in Boy from the North Country the surname once used by Amos Oz.
I call the character in the book Evan Klausner, and Evan is my middle name, and I needed a last name. And Klausner is the name that Amos Oz dropped when he gave himself the name Oz, which in Hebrew means courage, and he gave himself that name after his mother's death. And I read his memoir for the first time after my mother's death. And it was to me the most poignant, intimate, emotionally powerful story I had ever read of a son describing his mother.
All that and more coming up next. Welcome to the 5 Books, Sam. I'm really delighted to have you here. This book is really a love letter to your mother and just a testament to her having accomplished in its truest form what I think mothers all hope for, which is that their love travels forward and in some ways inoculates their children against future pain to come. So can you tell us in your words a little bit about your book and why did you choose to write it as autofiction?
Yeah, well, it's a great pleasure to be with you, Tali. Thank you for having me. And I think what you described is really the essence of the book. It's about a young man who grows up unsure about the identity of his biological father and thinks that his sense of self has to come through that. And through the course of trying to understand who that person is and understanding his mother's relationship with Bob Dylan, who strangers are telling him he looks like, and the times align that his mother had a relationship with Dylan and that might be his biological father. But the search for Dylan leads this young man closer to understanding who his mother is. And it's a search for a father that ends in finding the mother who raised him. I wrote that story in my own terms as a memoir essay in Harper's Magazine, an essay called The Silent Type on possibly being Bob Dylan's son. And it was important to me that when I went to write the story at greater length, it was a novel rather than a memoir, because I think so much of what every artist wants for him or herself is to tell a story that is larger than ourselves and larger than our life experience. And so much of the deep themes of this novel are about what it means to reach into ourselves to create a meaningful work of art and how we come to know ourselves more deeply in that process. And my mother's character who I call June, when she narrates her experience as a young artist in this bohemian Jewish New York world in the 1970s. She's playing Stella Adler and coming to a deeper understanding of who she is through this role. And when we meet Dylan in this book, which is drawn from my mother's experience in life, he's drawing on what he's experiencing to write the songs that become Blood on the Tracks. And my character, whose name is Evan, is drawing on much of what has been complicated or painful in his own life to write the novel that will become Boy from the North Country. So it was important to me that it be a novel and that it stand on its own as a work of art and not merely be defined by me and my life experience.
What are we supposed to do and say and be during this time?
Judaism has so much complexity to it and so many layers to it that no one layer stands by itself.
What you have is Jews who for the very first time feel like their value system is out of sync with the broader sector.
I'm your host, Alana Steinhain. Welcome to Texting IRL, where we wrestle with the dilemmas of Jewish life through the lens of classical and modern Torah texts. I am so fortunate that I have a friend and a colleague who I can talk to, Jacob Feinsman, Diana Ginsburg, Dahlia Lithwick, helping us think through these big questions.
Why are you guys part of this? What calls you personally to it? What are some of the other things that you work on? What's at stake for you?
I think one of the challenges is to figure out how much failed democracy we as Jews can tolerate.
We have to find opportunities to make enemies into friends.
The model is so majestic in this text.
Listen now to Texting IRL, a podcast from the Shalom Hartman Institute, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to the beauty of Jewish interpretation.
Exactly.
Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood. My Name is Asher Lev, by Chaim Potak.
I had such a rich and unconventional Jewish upbringing. And the first thing to say is that I grew up in a part of the world in upstate New York where there weren't a huge number of Jews. The largest community was Kiryas Yoel, the Hasidic community, a few miles down the road. And, my mother had a deep spiritual sense of Judaism, but she'd had challenging experiences in the congregational world as a younger person. And at a certain point in her life, she had really decided that what she valued most were the spiritual dimensions, teachings that she gave to me, but we weren't part of any congregation. And what that meant is that Judaism for us so much lived in literature. It lived in the spiritual ideas that she would talk to me about. I mean, she gave me, Martin Buber's Hasidic Tales and Chaim Potak, who we're going to talk about. And I think that gave me a unique perspective on Judaism, that so much of what our tradition has to offer, it's a way of passing wisdom intergenerationally through narrative. And that's what my mother was doing with me. And that's what I tried to do also in Boy from the North Country, to write a book that would hold so much of my mother's wisdom and what she was trying to give to me, and that I could pass that forward through a story. I think to me that's so much the essence of the Judaism that I know and love.
I felt that exactly in how you wrote your book. You're talking about your mother's experience with Judaism, and you write about your grandmother's desire to escape from her parents' shtetl Judaism and your mother's search to find her own meaning. There's a lot of ideas of Hasidism and finding holiness in the everyday. Do you know much about what your mother's Jewish education was like, or how she came to those ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's part of what interests me in this book is the tension between assimilationism and holding on to a sense of Jewish identity. I'm always fascinated by the way that, especially in America, people go about constructing an identity that is both American and ritually Jewish. And so I write about, my great-grandparents were Orthodox, and, they were immigrants to this country. They came from Eastern Europe, and their children and I should say the grandparents in this book there are aspects of who my grandparents were who are in those characters, but that's a part of the book, that there's also composition and novelization. And, those, for them, they're drawn to everything that was American, jazz and rock and roll. And my grandmother would tell this story about how her parents wanted her to marry this local Orthodox rabbi. And to her, she just thought this was the craziest idea. I mean, marry a rabbi. She was 20 years old. She was, the man she eventually married, my grandfather, was a jazz musician. She was a singer. And her parents just thought, well, what could be more stable than marrying a rabbi? That's a good offer. And they were living in Bensonhurst, and, she was born 3 months before the Great Depression. They struggled financially. Rabbi makes an offer to marry you, that's something you take seriously. That was happening in Brooklyn that must have happened in 1949. And so my grandparents, I think, did try to get far away from their parents' orthodoxy. And, they sent my mother to Hebrew school, but I think in some ways it was sort of, I don't want to speak for them, but my sense is it was that generation in which you sent your kids to Hebrew school out of obligation, but the focus in the home was really, how do we be American? And so my mother did not have the most wonderful experience in Jewish institutional life, but really valued many of the spiritual and the cultural ideas. And, by the time she's in New York in the 1970s, which I write about in the book, she's studying with Stella Adler and Norman Rabin, who is the youngest child of Shalom Aleichem. And these are two artists who care deeply about bringing the Yiddish Eastern European cultural traditions to America, who are instrumental in drawing on those rich Jewish artistic traditions to shape 20th century American theater and painting. And so they weren't artists who just happened to be Jewish. They were artists who were drawing very deeply on ideas within Jewish artistic and spiritual tradition. And part of what I'm trying to do in the book is highlight that and bring it to the surface. And also, I think, explain, because it can strike people as unfamiliar, explain how someone like my mother could have had a deeply rich, expressive Jewish identity without being part of a conventional congregation.
You also talk about your experience being bullied, and part of that was an anti-Semitic experience, right?
I had horrific experiences. With hideous, violent anti-Semitism growing up. I think for many people in the area I grew up, they grew up hearing about how, these Jews in Kiryas Yoel were ruining their town. There was this great anger directed towards Kiryas Yoel, which I know that many Jews disagree with me. I think most of that is pretty unfair. This was an area that was suburbanizing and developing, and a lot of the people who moved to this area seemed also upset that Hasidic Jews were moving to this area. But everyone was moving to this area. It's 75 miles from New York City. When I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, the population of both, Hasidic Jews and others was expanding. And to me, Kiryas Yoel is actually in some ways a very American story. A community that fled persecution and the Holocaust and came to America and went to this rural area because it was open and free and they could have their community. But let's just say that was not the perspective of most of the teenagers that I was growing up with. It's hard to almost describe the anti-Semitism I experienced because it's such a caricature. Kids would throw pennies at me. Kids would just walk by my table and drop bacon onto my lunch tray. When our school bus went past Kiryas Yoel, the larger boys would shove me against the window and they would, point to some Hasidic man. There'd be 3 or 4 Hasidic men walking on the street and they'd say to me, which of those kikes is your father? Just really grotesque behavior. And I'll say that, the school I went to was completely permissive of this, and their attitude was just sort of, well, boys will be boys. There's not much we can do. And I also want to say, that sort of racism was also experienced in that local public school by Black and Hispanic and Asian friends that I had. And there was a real cultural clash between families who'd moved to this area maybe one generation ago, many of whom were immigrants, and, a sort of wider, more conservative community that had been here for a long time. And that anti-Semitism fit within that framework of racism that many, many people I knew in high school experienced.
That's so painful to hear about. Oh, I'm wondering, when in this trajectory did you read My Name is Asher Lev?
So I remember the first time that I found My Name is Asher Lev. My mother gave it to me. She had a very subtle way, especially when I was a teenager and I didn't always take her advice about what books I should be reading. And sometimes she would just sort of put a book on my desk or my bed and wait for me to pick it up. And I'm looking at this book, which is marked. I'll hold it up. You can see I've read it many times. The cover is torn off, and I see that it's marked May 9th, 2006. I don't know if that's the first time I read it, but it seems it's the first time that I marked that I read it. And I remember reading the back of this book, and I'll just read one sentence that's on the back. It's the first sentence of the book. This is the opening. My name is Asher Lev, the Asher Lev, about whom you have read in newspapers and magazines, about whom you talk so much at your dinner affairs and cocktail parties, the notorious and legendary Lev of the Brooklyn crucifixion. I am an observant Jew. Yes, of course, observant Jews do not paint crucifixions. As a matter of fact, observant Jews do not paint at all. And immediately from those first sentences, the book just seized my imagination because it seemed to speak to so many of the themes in my life. I was at an age where I was starting to write. I was, the kid in the back of the class scrawling poetry in a marble composition book. I was bullied for that. And also, of course, I was fascinated by Hasidic Jews because there were so many around us, but I didn't know any. Right? So here is this story of a young man who wants to be an artist, who comes from a community that fascinated me, but I didn't know much about. And it's his story of how he creates a work of art that the Brooklyn crucifixion, which I won't ruin anything for those who have read the book, but a work of art that when I first read it, it seemed majestic, magical. The idea that you could write something or paint something that would be notorious, that would interest other people in that sort of way. And I think at that age, literature writing was something that was very private for me. The idea that there was a community where people sat around, what does he say, the dinner affairs and cocktail parties and talk about a work of art. Well, that was a world that I wanted to belong to. That was very far away. And I didn't want them to be talking about my work of art, but the idea that they were talking about a work of art, I wanted to belong to that world. And I thought if I kept reading that maybe I would enter it. And I felt that way as I read the book.
What makes you keep coming back to it?
To me, it's a great story of coming into oneself as an artist. That Asher Lev, from this young age, he has a gift for painting. It is, as he alludes to in those first sentences, it's forbidden in his religious world. And the story is him coming into an understanding of what it will mean to become the artist he's determined to be and to hold on to the relationships that matter most to him. And it's also a story of how he can become himself most fully by painting his life. It's a story of how art is not merely there to amuse or entertain us, but is also a deep form of self-knowledge. It's a way of understanding who we are. And there's a wonderful mother character at the center of the story.
I love hearing you talk about it, and just in general, when hearing authors talk about books where you can just, in their description of it, you can see all the things that they bring forward into their own work.
And can I add one more thing? Asher Lev has the novel is set in part in the Hasidic community in Crown Heights where he grew up, but in the novel he has to travel very far away from that world in order to appreciate all the ways in which it shaped him. He feels that he is fleeing the Hasidic community. He's fleeing this oppressive religious world. But in writing the book, he comes to understand that is the world that made me who I am. And for me, because of the painful experiences we were talking about when I was growing up in upstate New York, of course, when I was reading this book, I was 15, I wanted to get as far away as I could. And I did. I spent most of my 20s living abroad. I came home to see my mom, but outside of that, I didn't keep in touch with people I grew up with. But it was only as an adult, when I started writing Boy from the North Country, that I came to understand all the ways in which this world that I resented really shaped who I am. And the world that my mother created here, my earliest memories are of her reading to me. We lived in this house in the woods where what she taught me to value were the things that I still love to this day: reading in nature, taking in the natural beauty. And, when I went abroad, I felt, okay, what makes me unique is that, I went to Oxford, I've lived in London or Berlin. And now at this point in my life, you realize, plenty of people have lived abroad. That's a cliche experience. What makes me feel that I'm myself, what gave me who I am, is what makes me unique is the world that my mother curated for me. It's this house in the woods where she taught me to love art and books, and we didn't have TV, and she managed not to let me know about the internet until I was 11 or 12. Those are the things that made me a writer. And that's a journey that Asher Lev takes us on.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood, A Tale of Love and Darkness by Amos Oz. You reference the main character, Evan, having read this as a teen. I'm wondering if you did as well, and what impact it had on you then, and how it's continued to shape you as an adult.
That's a fiction and a tribute. I didn't actually read A Tale of Love and Darkness until my 20s, and I call the character in the book, Evan Klausner, is my narrator, and Evan is my middle name, and I needed a last name, and Klausner is the name that Amos Oz dropped when he gave himself the name Oz, which in Hebrew means courage, and he gave himself that name after his mother's death. And I read his memoir for the first time after my mother's death, and it was to me the most poignant, intimate, emotionally powerful story I had ever read of a son describing his mother. And what stood out to me most in this book is that Oz orbits his mother, Fanya. He writes about her from the perspective of being a boy, the boy who was her son. He writes about the experience of losing her to suicide when he was 12. He writes about the experience of trying to look her in the eye when he's in his late 30s, the age at which her life ended, and thinking about her almost as a peer. And by the end of the book, which he wrote in his early 60s, he's reflecting on her almost from the vantage point. He writes that he's old enough to be her father. And his life orbits hers, and he's in search of this deeper understanding of who she was as a person. And I think after my mother's death, something I really struggled with was the sense that the relationship was over. She wasn't here anymore. And I was reading that book alone in this house in the woods where I had grown up with her and where I stayed after her death. And I felt her spirit here. And through that book, I also had a sense of the ways in which writing and literature could expand my relationship to her, and that relationship could keep going. And I think sometimes in our culture, we really struggle with understanding the relationship between the living and the dead, and how deep and active it can be. And Oz was really a model for me of what that can mean. And I think I also saw so much of myself in his descriptions of his childhood. And I saw so much of my mother in his descriptions of his mother. And, you know, both of our mothers were people who earlier in their lives had aspired to their own lives as artists or writers. And that didn't happen in a conventional professional sense, significantly because they were women at the time that they were living. And what each of them gave, I mean, I can't speak for him, but just as a reader and admirer of his work, and speaking for myself, my mother gave so much of her love for literature to me. And I wouldn't be a writer without her. And Oz is paying a similar tribute to his mother in that book. And that was just so deeply inspiring to me. So I took the name he left behind for his character. You know, one man's refuse is another's treasure. And that's certainly no comparison, but it is a tribute and an act of admiration for what he's given to me as his reader.
I'm so glad you told us that. I was wondering, I was planning to ask you if that was just a coincidence, but I'm glad to know. How conscious were you in writing your book of this framework that Oz gave you?
I was conscious of the influence. And there are 3 or 4 writers who, you know, when I'm lost, I go back to their work and try to find a sense of rootedness. And there were days when I was struggling with writing Boy from the North Country. I would call up my closest friend, who also loves Amos Oz, and we would read passages back and forth to each other. And I would read him what I was writing. And then he'd say, you know what, that's really missing. Why don't you listen? Let me read you this passage from A Tale of Love and Darkness. Think about how Oz would approach this. And we would go back and forth. So I think part of the great freedom of being a writer is you get to choose who you want to be influenced by. You know, they say in life that your personality over time ends up being a compilation of the 5 or 7 people you spend the most time with. And there's something akin in writing that you're choosing what sort of writer you're going to be in the writers you spend time with. Sartre has a great line where he says, I think this is in Existentialism as a Humanism, he says, you choose the advice that you're going to follow when you decide from whom you are seeking it. Right? And I think that's so true in writing, and Oz was the person whose advice I wanted.
You reference having lived in Jerusalem. Were you there when you read this book, or did that impact how you read Oz at all?
That was earlier in my life, although I did, on a few trips back to Jerusalem afterward, I always brought A Tale of Love and Darkness. And I think I also understand Jerusalem in a deeper sense through reading that book. And I mean, among many, many other things, that is such a rich portrait of Jerusalem in the 1940s and his childhood and the world that he's describing. He describes walking across that city on Shabbat afternoons. He is an extraordinary guide to that city, and I've been lucky to have him leading me through it.
Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview, In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. I want to talk about In Search of Lost Time, which, again, you write about Evan having read. You call it the dream novel, and I want to just read to you how you describe it. These are snippets of what you write, but you write, the novel was itself a life. Every page radiated human touch, sight, sound, tastes. Proust's narrator was mesmerized by life as it is remembered, for it is only memory that makes each of us a self. Memory, the narrator suggests, is hidden in the stray objects of our lives. We can never hope to collect all the pieces of ourselves, so none of us are ever more than a series of fractured recollections, incomplete, contingent, subject to infinite revision, and to that extent, fictional. Tell me about reading Proust.
I read Proust for the first time in college, and I described that experience in pages from which you've just read an excerpt in Boy from the North Country. That encounter was really one of the great experiences of my reading life. And actually, when I finished the last edits on Boy from the North Country, I spent 3 months rereading the entirety of In Search of Lost Time. It was the first time in my life that I wasn't writing every day. I had given everything I could as a writer to Boy from the North Country, and I needed a slight break, and I spent those months with Proust. I've rarely encountered a writer who has such a deep sense of what it means to experience our daily lives in a divine way. The Proust, in Search of Lost Time, he looks out into the world, and every experience seems majestic. The way that he can describe his eyes roving across the room between different people at a party and just how they're looking at each other or what they're saying, or the way he can describe walking down a street or through a park. There's a sense that everything in life is majestic and romantic, and I was drawn in by that. And there's also a deep nostalgia, especially in the opening pages of The Search, for childhood and for that dreamy, expansive, imaginative feeling of childhood. And I wanted to live in that world. And I think the portrait that he has of his summers as a child in, this town in rural France, his family is spending the summer, and this is the 1870s. There's no technology. There's nothing to distract anyone from each other. And so he has the most intimate descriptions of how human beings are like with one another. And that reminded me in some ways of the social rhythms of my own childhood, that, when someone would come to our house, when I would meet someone, that was an event. And I would be curious about everything about that person. And I think in a way that's what makes you a writer, that curiosity in other people. And then through the 7 volumes of The Search, I think what Proust is really showing us is that if you look at people for long enough, it's not easy, but you begin to see the essence of who they are. And no one who we meet in The Search, their characters, their truest self, it's not apparent at the beginning. It takes years, it takes thousands of pages. But what is so deeply humanistic in The Search is the way that it gradually reveals each of these people to one another.
Beautiful. Thank you. I loved
that. Was rambling, and I'm
that
sorry.
Was not rambling. That was beautiful. And also just reading about your experience of reading him, I found so profound. It almost made me want to go through the 3,000 however many pages. I'm not sure, not quite. But
you can experience the beauty just with 20 or 30 pages. No one should feel that it's all or nothing.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. Book 4, the book you're reading now, Our Evenings by Alan Hollinghurst.
I'm reading Our Evenings by Alan Hollinghurst, who I think is maybe the great living English writer. Hollinghurst writes these delicate, sumptuous novels, often of gay life in contemporary London, and his characters are always slight outsiders, and the sentences, you can't find sentences like that. I mean, you could walk into a whole Barnes & Noble and search for an afternoon and maybe not come away with sentences like Hollinghurst writes.
Book 5, the author's latest book, Boy from the North Country by Sam Sussman. You describe Dylan, I think this is from your Harper's piece, where you describe him as a Jew fluent in tradition but rooted in rural America, a storyteller, which equally describes you. I was struck by the extent to which you describe your conversations with your mother, or Evan's conversations with his mother, and her conversations with Dylan as being so steeped in Jewish references, as you were talking about in her experience, and the extent to which that permeates and colors their relationship to each other. There's a portion where you write about their conversation, and Dylan's talking about the Talmud. And he says, hundreds of years of commentary are all on the same page, nothing fixed in time, how we have lived and how we should live and how we will live, endless meaning on a single page. Playing the song the same way is like asking the Torah to mean the same thing to everyone who read it. No color there, nothing worthwhile, got to keep that page open. So I understand those are your words and based on recollections, etc. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how much of that Jewish vocabulary do you think was part of the intimacy that connected your mom to Dylan?
Well, it's interesting. My mother met Dylan at one of the Jewish moments of his life, and that's what I've written about. So just take a step back and explain. My mother met Dylan in a painting class taught by Norman Rabin. Rabin was the youngest child of Sholem Aleichem, and he had a painting studio in Carnegie Hall. And in 1974, Dylan was going through personal and artistic crisis. He was in his early 30s. He felt that he hadn't written anything worthwhile since the first half of his 20s, since Blonde on Blonde. And he really felt that if he didn't write something meaningful soon, he was never going to. He was going to be known as this, baby-faced folk hero who then went up to Woodstock and sort of vanished. And one day he heard people talking about Rabin. Rabin was a painter who was known for using painting to help artists of other forms find something that they were searching for. So my mother was studying with Rabin because Stella Adler would send actors and actresses to study with Rabin. Adler and Rabin were friends. And Dylan walks into Rabin's studio hoping that Rabin can use painting to in some way get Dylan out of the autistic crisis he's living through. And later, Dylan would credit Rabin for Blood on the Tracks. He'd say that he put his hand and his mind straight and he taught him how to see. Dylan would talk about his blindness, that he was going through blindness. That's how he would talk about it to my mother. And so we see Dylan in this book turning to this depth of Jewish spiritual and artistic wisdom to write the songs that would become Blood on the Tracks. And a lot of those ideas just came right from Rabin. And, Rabin was someone who was steeped in Jewish knowledge and education, and that was his world. I mean, most of Rabin's contemporaries and the artists, the circles that he belonged to, were like him, old world Jews who had immigrated to New York. So that language and those ideas were what he had to offer, and Dylan was drawing deeply on that. And then separately, those ideas and that world deeply influenced my mother, and it's the Jewish identity that she gave to me. And so I think I had a particular vantage point. Let me just say, I think it would be easy for someone to write about Dylan and Rabin without paying intimate attention to what was happening Jewishly between them, because so much is happening artistically. But, my vantage point as a Jewish artist who's also drawing on the same tradition to write my own novel, that predisposed me to be interested in what was happening Jewishly between my mother, Dylan, and Norman Rabin.
Those descriptions of being in Rabin's classroom, it did feel like those last wisps of like a certain old world of Sholem Aleichem, and talking about Chagall, you felt like the vapors of it. I think, there are sections of the book that are told from June's perspective and revisiting her past that are riddled with a lot of pain, sexual abuse as a child, as a college student. She was raped as a young woman. And yet you describe this moment where she makes this extraordinary choice that she will heal by giving the love to others that she did not receive. And you spoke about this a little bit before, but as I was reading it, it really felt like you were almost like writing the tale of a Hasidic master, that you were like transmitting your mother's teachers as this Hasidic master. You know, she speaks in parables and stories and also has these very intentional teachings about how the body is destined to heal, how people are capable of transformation and transforming pain into love. Does that reading resonate for you?
Very deeply. And it means a great deal to me that you read it in that light. Yeah. And for me, in some ways, that's the most profound lesson that I had to learn from my mother. And, you know, after her death, I've struggled tremendously with my grief. I had never been through such emotional difficulty. And I was here in the house where she lived and I'd grown up, where I'm talking to you from today. And, you know, I was 26 and my world had fallen apart. I had lost the person I was closest to and I didn't know how to keep living. And I had to think about how my mother had drawn on her own experiences of loss and grief and trauma to make meaning in her life. And she used to say, we're here to take the pieces of the universe we've been given, burnish them with love, and return them in better condition than we received them. And for her, what that meant was drawing on the experiences that you were describing, particularly of sexual violence, and using her experience of those things to help other women who had been through something similar heal. And she had a deep faith that people could heal through love and that her purpose was to give that to other people. You know, part of what I hoped to do in writing this book, I felt that her death was the most difficult piece of the universe I had been given. And what it meant for me to burnish that with love was to write a novel in which the love would be larger than the grief and the loss, and in which I could tell a story of loss and healing to other people who'd been through something similar, and in which that might mean something to them. And that's what my mother thought art was for, that it was to share love and meaning between people. And that is not how I thought about what literature was beforehand. And that was something I had to learn very deeply from her.
That encapsulation of the taking piece of the universe that we've been given and burnishing them with love, it felt like such a perfect encapsulation of what the Kabbalistic idea of tikkun olam is, right? And how we gather things and bring them back together and perfect them. You tell a story that June, the mother character, tells of two women who are not sure who's Mashiach. I was hoping you could tell that story. In the novel, you say that, you know, Evan says he doesn't understand it, and his mother says, you will. If you could read that passage for us and then tell us if you now know what it means.
Thank you. I love this story. My mother told it to me in life, and I wrote it into the novel. It goes like this. Once, my mother said to me, a young woman unsure of her place in the world begins to wander the land. She speaks to old people and young people, rich people and poor people, happy people and unhappy people. She takes pleasure in listening to the story of each life. One day, she meets another wandering woman. The second woman says she's listening to the story of each person she meets because she is the Mashiach. The first woman walks ahead, distrustful of anyone who would think of herself in such grandiose terms. She hopes not to see the second woman again. That night, the two women rest at the same inn. The first woman watches the second woman speak to an elderly man. She hears the questions she asks. She sees the same smiles and laughs. She realizes the man does not know which of the women believes she is the Mashiach and which is merely a wandering woman. Both are lost. Both are trying to make sense of the world's infinite complexities. With this realization, The first woman approaches the second. They share their stories. They embrace. They journey on together. My mother smiled knowingly. Mom? Evan? I don't understand the story. I know, honey, but you will. Well, I think, like any good writer, I can only respond to the story with another story. And the story that is my response to my mother's story is Boy from the North Country.
That's perfect. You write towards the beginning of the book, nothing returns us to ourselves like a story rightly told. So I was going to ask if you feel you've been returned to yourself.
I do. I feel, in some sense, that I've never been more fully myself and never been more comfortable with who I am. And, you know, this book was published 8 years to the day of my mother's death. And that was pure coincidence. Writers don't control the date their book is published, and my publisher didn't know that. And that felt like an important stop along the way of what have been the two journeys of my adult life. And the first has been to make meaning out of my mother's death and come to emotional terms with that experience. And the second has been to write a worthwhile novel. And Norman Rabin, my mother's painting instructor, would say, every painting is a failure, but the purpose is to create a worthwhile failure. So, 8 years later, I feel that you never entirely heal the grief of losing someone you love, but you can make meaning out of that, and you can use that experience to share with other people who have gone through something similar. I feel that, even if only for myself, I've written what Rabin would call a worthwhile failure. And so, yes, in some ways, these experiences have made me feel returned to myself.
Well, I thank you for sharing it with us. It's a luminous portrayal of love. And I think, as we've been talking about, you can read the book on so many different levels, just in terms of the literature and the writing. It's exquisite. Then there's your mother's teachings, which felt like a gift to be able to receive those from her. And as a mother, just reading it sort of brings you back to the core of what you're trying to accomplish in parenting children. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tali, for such wonderful questions and such a meaningful conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Sam Sussman, talking about his autobiographical novel, Boy from the North Country. You can find a link to the book and all the others Sam discussed in our show notes. You can also find a link to subscribe to New Reads, a new project from the Jewish Book Council, where they curate a selection of 6 Jewish books sent to your home every other month. Sam's book is the November pick, and you'll find all kinds of other materials about the book sent along with it. If you've read one of the wonderful books recommended on our show, we'd love to hear about it. Drop us a comment on our Instagram @5bookspod or in our email, team@5bookspod.org. If you'd like an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes and links to all the books we discussed and some other goodies directly in your inbox, you can sign up for our newsletter in the show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org, where you can also find transcripts for all episodes. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Amelia Merrill. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Elad Lifshitz of the Dove Abramson Studio. Thanks especially to Daniel Septimus and the Jewish Book Council.